environment. So let me move to the host for this evening, Brian Stewart. During his many years as a foreign correspondent for the CBC, Brian gave all of us a window on the world. Well, me maybe more, because I'm his wife. He has reported from 10 war zones and interviewed many of the leading figures of our time, including Margaret Thatcher, Lech Wałęsa, and Nelson Mandela. In fact, you may have seen him. He's been on the air a lot recently on CBC in the wake of Nelson Mandela's death. Since his retirement from CBC in 2009, Brian has continued to appear on the network from time to time. He also writes a column. And he is now a distinguished senior fellow with the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Please welcome Brian Stewart.
Thank you very much indeed. How to do a brief introduction of Michael Ignatieff. In the mid-1980s, I was working as a CBC correspondent in London during what seemed a rather soulless and grim time of Thatcherism, when I was struck and moved by the uplifting success of a book, The Needs of a Stranger. The Needs of Strangers, forgive me. A call on us to master the skills of what makes us human and keep us in touch with one another. It was the first time I took note of its author and rising international star academic, Michael Ignatieff. In the years since, I've watched the most extraordinary arc of an amazing career. Ignatieff as TV host in Britain, a documentary reporter in war-torn Bosnia, author of surely a score of critically acclaimed books and novels, giver of highlight speeches, countless interviews, many of them with me, and a rise to the summits of academia, including Harvard. He became one of the premier scholar intellectuals of his generation, a source of considerable Canadian pride. Actually, we in the media always refer to him as Canadian scholar Michael Ignatieff. And then came politics. And conservative attack ads suddenly claimed he was not quite Canadian enough. In any case, Michael spent 5 years struggling for power and the effectiveness that power can bring within the wild, whirling vortex of our modern politics. After what we all may agree was a stunning defeat, he has returned to academe and has written a remarkable book about that political experience called Fire and Ashes, which one British reviewer declares is simply hard to beat as an insightful, compelling, and strangely moving account of contemporary politics. I agree. I just add one thing, that I've been disappointed over many years, that modern politicians, unlike some ancients, have failed to give us really very frank and personal looks inside that strange world of politics that can both repel and sometimes inspire us. Well, Michael Ignatieff has, and we're very lucky to have him here tonight. Michael, please join us. Thank you, Michael, for being here. I would be remiss in beginning tonight without asking you for some reflection on Mandela, and specifically on whether you think his example, that kind of example that the odd great figure of history brings, whether it can actually last, or does it tend to fade within a generation?
Well, first of all, just before I get to that, thank you for doing this. I go back with this guy a long time, and he's a wonderful journalist and a treasure. So I'm glad to be here.
And if I could just intervene, we were actually struggling academics, or rather students, at the same time in Toronto. I barely crawled my way out of Ryerson journalism. Michael went on somewhat higher, but
anyway. This could go on all night. I don't think it's such a good idea, but I also just want to thank the library. This is a wonderful institution. I live close by. Balzac's makes a very good cappuccino, and it fills me with joy when I go into the big atrium and see people studying and learning, and it's a wonderful place. And thank you all for coming. It's a cold night, so we got to warm them up, Brian.
Indeed.
There we go. To the question, Mandela. There is a way, I think, in which commemoration of a truly great historical figure kind of wraps them in cotton wool and we lose them in the process of commemoration. It's a mysterious thing that happened this week. I want to remember him, oddly, as a brilliant politician. Somebody recalled this morning the moment in which he dealt with someone who said, well, the Springboks, the great South African rugby team, we ought to change it completely. You know, it's Afrikaan, it's white, it doesn't reflect the new South Africa. And he said, leave it exactly the way it is. This is part of our national traditions. Well, that's an example of great political judgment. It's one of the reasons why white South Africans wept at his death, because he understood them. He understood they weren't going anywhere. They were as much part of the fabric of South Africa as the majority population. But that's political genius. It's also moral genius as well. I mean, you know, and we celebrate that. But you don't want commemoration to kind of rub the edges off him. And you know, he was a politician, among other things.
Absolutely, and as you point out, he did what only somebody skilled in politics. I mean, it has been written by several people that he's been compared at times to Lincoln. Not only did he save a nation, but he did so with a great deal of cunning and real political skill. He could read people. He knew how to bring warring factions together. It was quite remarkable. Now, to go back to our day and our politics, I want to start your book where the fire actually meets the ashes, if I might. Because I've covered big historic events, but I've always wondered what it's like to be inside that whirling vortex. Say, I'm going to start on the election night where you lost. You're in a suite somewhere. Millions of people are watching the result. Cameras were everywhere outside. You've just come through a long campaign. What is it like to be at the very few people actually have been in that position?
I'm down at the Delta Chelsea downtown, up on the 12th floor, in the kind of hotel room I don't normally stay in, you know, one of those big ones with lots of rooms. There are a lot of people there. We know it's not going to be a great night, but it's a sensation of falling dominoes as the results begin to come in from the East Coast. And then it gets dramatically, suddenly, and historically bad for us in Quebec. So quite early on in the night, you know that your political life is over. The room goes pretty still. The people who were with you all the way are silent. There's nothing much to say. No, you can't be comforted exactly, and you don't feel you need comfort. It's just the people have decided. And I'd never been in a national election before, and there is something awesome in that overused word about the judgment of the people. The people all right across the country have made a judgment. It's a tough one, but it's also shocking, so you don't kind of take it in. You're on autopilot. And then somebody says, you better go downstairs. There are people down in the ballroom, and you gotta, you know. And you can't really prepare for a moment like that, so there's no speech. You just get up and try and say what you think about it. And I think I said something to the effect that failure was a great teacher, and I would learn its lessons. And I remember saying that, and that was what I thought. I had failed, and it was time to learn the lessons, and our party would learn the lessons, and the country would learn whatever lessons it had to learn. And it was also a night of triumph for other people. Let's also remember, it wasn't so great for me, but it was a pretty great night for Jack Layton and for Mr. Harper, and that has to be acknowledged.
You wrote about that period, that immediate aftermath. I lived the life, I paid for what I learned, I pursued the flame of power and saw hope dwindle to ashes. What about the regrets? Did you have many regrets that you had actually taken that plunge?
Oh, sure. I mean, I'd had I'd had a good life, so there were moments when it's going really badly, when you think, why am I sitting here getting kicked around all the time? And this, I'm not having fun here. It's not the thrill I thought it would be. But it's extremely important to understand that if you choose with your eyes open to go into politics, you take what's coming. It is senseless and childish to complain about it. You just suck it up. That's what you're in the arena to do. So I never felt, it's all so unfair. I just thought, how do I turn this around? And I couldn't. But regrets? No, I have no regrets about doing it. If that's the question, no regrets about doing it at all. And I think you would understand it, Brian. I'd spent most of my life up in the stands watching the hockey game. And I think there's a time when you've been in the stands when maybe it's diluted, you think, I'm going to put my skates on. And I did get on the ice. And, I got pretty effectively knocked into the boards. But if you ask me what I don't regret, it's that I put my skates on. I did it. And if you've been a professor and a writer all your life, nobody will be able to accuse me of just being a spectator. It didn't work, but I wasn't a spectator.
And you had certainly studied Canada, known about it, it was part of your persona. You had a compelling thought about what you might be able to do for this country and what was needed at this time, presumably, when you went into it.
I think I did. I think it came out of, I have to go down memory lane a little bit. My dad was an immigrant, came here with nothing. That was very much part of my sense of the country. My father had enormous gratitude to this country, the way you have when it's given you a new home. I grew up in Mike Pearson and Pierre Trudeau's Canada. I thought it was a wonderful country. It gave me, my education. I felt a deep sentimental loyalty to that Canada. Now here's the problem. But that Canada was from the 50s and 60s. It was the Canada I grew up in, the Canada where you didn't lock your doors, and you bumbled home through the snow and you'd forgot your mitt. You were so happy being a kid, you couldn't, it was just being a kid, in that Canada. And then I come back 40 years later, and that Canada in many ways is gone. It's not that it's been dismantled, it's just the country has changed. And I think, so in some sense I may have had a nostalgic vision of the country, not a vision that necessarily met the demands of Canada today. That's just something you learn.
You're quite right about, we shared the tendency of being in the stands. You do when you're covering something or writing on something. You begin to think you know how it really works inside politics. And any number of journalists think they've kind of really figured it out. And if they had a chance, they'd kind of be able to do it a little better than those who are doing it now. Yeah. But you found out we're living an illusion.
Absolutely, yeah. And the funny thing about it is that one of the things that I would say to this audience is there is a huge amount of cynicism about politicians out there. My experience of doing it for 5.5 years was actually to increase my respect for people of all parties who do it half decently. A lot of the people who turn out to would be my political heroes now are people that most Canadians don't know anything about, kind of backbench MPs who get up every morning. I mean, the guy who is a hero to me was our MP for the Yukon. The Yukon is a huge piece of real estate, right? I mean, it's really large, and he was the one MP for the Yukon. He would get home on a Thursday night, dead tired from Ottawa in Whitehorse. He would then drive, 800 kilometers to Dawson to a school picnic, come back, see his wife, get on the plane, go back to Ottawa, which is, 8-hour flight, worked like a dog in Ottawa. He was a rink rat. We called him a rink rat. He was one of these guys who just hung around the house and loved being in the house. And those are the people who I think deserve the admiration of all Canadians. And they're in all parties. I can name you some in the NDP who do it. I name people in the Conservatives who do it. They're the people who I came out thinking and the thing about them is that they knew stuff I would never learn or never know as long as I live. If you asked, Larry Bagnell of the Yukon whether a certain measure would play in Whitehorse, you had to trust what Larry said. I mean, Larry just knew. And there was stuff that would not fly. And if you had a brain in your head, you would listen to Larry. Right. And that's the good part of politics. That's what you have representatives of the people for.
Another thing you found, and you mentioned writings by Machiavelli back in the 1500s that I think it's called the goddess Fortuna, plays a role in politics much more than outsiders believe. Could you describe exactly the phases of this remarkable chance?
Well, it's one of the things that when you do politics, it changes the way you teach politics. And I had for years been teaching Machiavelli's The Prince, which is a wonderful little masterpiece of beautiful writing mixed with cynicism, and I commend it to all of you. It's as fresh as a daisy 500 years later, and it's wonderful. But there's a chapter in the book called chapter 25, and it's about Fortuna, the goddess Fortuna. And I always kind of skipped that bit because I couldn't figure out why we'd be talking about this classical Greek goddess who he says rules politics. Well, all I can tell you is the minute you get into politics, you understand that the goddess Fortuna does rule politics. Machiavelli is completely right. That is fortune, chance, contingency, fate, stuff happens. And he understood that. Politics is not a science, it's an art because it's power in time, power moving through time, and everything's unexpected. Give you the example. I get elected on the 23rd of January 2006 in Etobicoke Lakeshore, and I'm pretty pleased about that and think, boy, I'm going to be an MP and I'll get to learn how to do my job. And that night, within an hour of being elected, Paul Martin resigns. So suddenly the cameras turn and they're shining at you saying, are you going to run for the leadership? I mean, honest to God, it was the last thing I expected. So you then play the cards you get dealt. And that's what I mean by Fortuna. You can't predict, you can't plan that.
You can't get that angry or take it personally if it turns against you, if the events suddenly explode up in your face.
Absolutely. You've got to, it's like a lot of things in life. Let me be grim for a minute. Did Jack Layton think he was going to get prostate cancer? Right. There's Fortuna in the really cruel, unforgiving, terrible kind. The Fortuna that affected me was, strictly mild compared to that.
So you have to deal with something that's an art but can't really be taught, you write, very easily. So much of it is gut feeling. So much of it is given to people who have, I guess, skilled gut feelings, if you can think of such a thing, instead of those who don't have them for quite a while. It's something that maybe not even experience gives you. It's a sense
there are a couple of things there. I mean, I earn my living teaching students about politics, and if you do politics, you learn that there are certain things that cannot be taught. They can only be learned by experience, by doing. I think we all know this in our lives. There are things you can learn out of a book, and then there's some things you just learn from life, and you got to understand the difference. And teachers have to understand the difference because there's just a lot of stuff you can't teach someone. They have to learn it the hard way. And that's very, very true in politics. But you can get better. You talked about gut refined by experience or something. That's absolutely right. I didn't have enough experience. There's just a lot of stuff you gotta learn. One of the crucial things that experience can teach you if you're in Ottawa is that there's a lot of stuff going on in Ottawa that doesn't matter, excuse my language, a damn. It just doesn't matter. It's just the news cycle. It's just going around in this little churn inside, and the rest of you out there have lives. You got to get the kids to school, you got to get them home, you got to do your jobs. You're not watching Ottawa, you couldn't care less. But in Ottawa, in the bubble, you think this is vital, dramatic stuff, and I've got to be right on this stuff inside a bubble. And people with political experience begin to get the sense that what's in the bubble isn't what's real. What's real is here. And getting that balance between the bubble and out of the bubble takes experience, it takes time.
I was surprised, even though I thought I knew and followed it fairly closely, the degree of animosity and antagonism, though, that you found in politics. The attack ads where you were labeled as the stranger, the failure of MPs to have even civil relationships across the floor, which I thought we are all told that MPs may fight in the House, but afterwards they all go out and have a drink together. That doesn't seem to happen in our age anymore. But what was it that really struck you in that sense of the temper of the times in our politics?
Yeah, it's a strange confession to make, but I was stunned by the adversarial character of politics. I don't know what the hell I thought I was going into. You know, I mean, maybe I thought it was a nice seminar. You know, kind of.
You hadn't watched enough question periods.
No, but I hadn't watched enough question periods. I watched some, but you know, that's, I think, and then you have to have the temperament for that. I am a fighter. I can take a punch as well. I can land a punch. But it took a long time to get used to the sheer adversarial relentlessness of politics. And then the other thing you said is about the partisanship. The partisanship is also strange because it affects the way you should look for this next time you're at Pearson on a Sunday night during the parliamentary session. Just watch the way MPs line up to get on the airplane to Ottawa. The Conservatives line up with the Conservatives, and the NDP drive. We don't fraternize, and it's nuts. We're all in the same place doing the same job, but you don't want to be seen to be too cozy with that dipper. You know, I mean, you just no. You don't want to be seen to be too cozy.
But isn't this an element?
That, let me tell you, I look back on it now and think that is crazy stuff, because these are decent men and women trying to do the same job.
But isn't this too the element of fear that seems to have crept into our politics? I think more than 20, 30 years ago, I'm not sure, but I think so, that MPs are afraid if they're seen with another MP from across the floor, they may be suspected of being ready to jump ship.
Yes, there was a recurrent fear that if you were fraternizing with, say, a conservative, it was preparatory to crossing the aisle. And that was, very overdone. But this is where there are some problems with our democracy. This is not insider baseball. This is about you. You want to be represented by people who represent you. And what we've got is a system where the parties have so much control, even over the, how you line up to get on a plane, that they're not representing you anymore. They're being controlled by parties. Now, those of you listening to this will think, well, he used to be the leader of a party. Why is he saying this? Is this honest? I'm looking at it now in retrospect and seeing in some ways we held the reins way too tight, and it wasn't good for our democracy that we held it so tight. And so Mr. Chung, the MP, is trying to loosen it up, and that debate is extremely important for the country. It's not just a little parliamentary thing. It turns on who do MPs represent? Who do they serve? Do they serve you or do they serve their parties? And we've got to get the balance better. This is where the political scientists will tell you that Australia, Britain, the parliamentarians have much more leeway, much more capacity to vote on their own, to kick the prime minister from time to time. We have, the political scientists say, the most authoritarian party system of any British parliamentary system. There's a tougher, stricter discipline in Canadian Parliament than, so those of you who say it's all Mr. Harper's fault, you see, that's part of the problem. It's been going on for a long time, this tightening up of discipline, and it's not good for our democracy, because you want to have people who speak for you, not for the party.
Indeed. In fact, Daniel Savoy has written about the growth of this prime ministerial power over almost a generation. And it's extremely alarming, because it's stifling a lot of the civil service that used to shine and expand. It creates parties with they're all wagons are all in a circle. Mm-hmm. And you say the age of persuasion is over, that politics is not so much anymore a time for persuading. It's more a time for barreling through, getting it done, using whatever method works.
Well, that was a thing about politics that was a shock to me. If you've been a professor and a teacher and a journalist like I have, you kind of fancy yourself as a communicator. You think, I can put the words together. And then you get into politics, and it's like everybody's speaking Swedish, right? It's just, you're just not good at it. You have to learn again. And I wanted a politics of persuasion. I mean, what I loved about politics, and I did love it, was going into a room and trying to talk about my ideas for the country, and listening to people who get up and say, that's the craziest thing I heard, and then, going back and forward and doing what I've done all my life, which is try to persuade. But politics doesn't work like that. Politics is, in a mass age with television and the media, it's a different game. It's message discipline, message promotion, a couple of cut lines at the end of an ad. Yeah. People's attention span, your attention span in this crowd, is besieged. I mean, my attention span is besieged. I can spend the whole day online just reading stuff. It's coming in all the time. And in a very crowded kind of blizzard of stuff,
vortex.
The vortex, politicians just got to go kaboom. And that makes the persuasive dialogue, which is at the heart of our democracy, minds changing other minds, discussing together what we want to do for this place that is our country, that does suffer. It just does.
And I must say, I think where I come from, the media, we're very complicit in this. I think over years we've come to rely upon the clash of ideas, the clash of words, the clash of personalities, if we can. Harder and harder to sell the idea past the city desk. So let's do a real in-depth look at how good the Statistics Canada works, or something like that. They want the fight. And of course, when people see nothing but the fight going on, they begin to lose faith in politics. And as they lose faith in politics, they want to have less and less to do with government, which leaves us in a position where government says, okay, we can cut some taxes, or exactly.
I think that's right. And I think the thing that you want is an odd thing to say. You want a curious political culture, in which we're asking questions about our country. The knock I would make of the press is not so much that you focus on the fight, because there is a fight. People disagree in this country. I mean, I just disagree with Mr. Harper about just about everything, right? And that ought to be focused. I mean, okay. But so you got to have a democracy where the debate is focused, and you folks make the choice. But you also want a political system and a media system that's kind of asking what's happening to the country. And most of the time at Ottawa, the media is kind of completely focused on these not terribly interesting parliamentarians. I was one of them. I'm not saying I was better. It's not fascinating, Ottawa. The parliamentary game is not fascinating. It's important that it be covered. And so you sort of sometimes felt that if we could just kind of flip it out so that we were more curious about the country. And I find the media not as curious about the country as it might be. And often politicians aren't as curious about the country as they should be.
But you also found yourself, Shirley, dealing with that dilemma that politicians face, that to do good you have to sometimes get pretty down in, call it the gutter if you want. But you were in fact criticized during the debate for having been on the offensive all the time while others tried a higher road. Yeah. Did you find yourself struggling very much with that inner moral struggle of, do I have to do this to do something good?
Yeah, I think there are lots of times in politics, but where you got to make a tough call, you got to fire somebody, you got to say something that you think is mostly true, 80% true, but not 100% true. Let's put it that way. I mean, I take this matter seriously. I tried never to lie to the Canadian people because I don't want to lie to myself, right? You know. But sometimes you shave it a little bit, let's be honest, and that bothers you. It bothers you morally because there are politicians, like there are people who lose any stable relation to the truth, whatever. There are such people, and you don't want to become that kind of person, you know. I mean, and it's a temptation in life. I actually felt that politics was simply presented, you know. A politician is paid to make the deals, the compromises, the difficult calls that all of us make in our lives. I mean, politics is just the professional version of the politics that we all do in our lives. And the politics we do in our lives involves compromise, it involves some forms of hypocrisy, it involves some forms of, you know, bringing the hammer down. And that's what you sign up when you do politics. We shouldn't ask our politicians to be saints. We should ask them to be honest, and we should hold them to the truth. But yeah, that's why you go into the arena, you put yourself at hazard.
Just a note before we go on, we will be coming to questions in about 10 minutes. So if you can be thinking of questions, short ones, to the point, and not debate questions, that'd be great. And the microphones you'll see on the floor. What's it like to go eyeball to eyeball with Stephen Harper, right across the floor in debate? I mean, he must be something of an extraordinary character, an individual, and Prime Minister.
Well, he's not Prime Minister for nothing. He's disciplined, relentless, tough, and he's got the coldest pair of eyes I've ever looked at in my life. And I didn't get the better of him often, but I treasure a couple of moments when I landed a punch. He's a politician all the way down, and I mean that in praise. That every instinct is political.
But you say that one of the great mistakes is to see him as an ideologue, as a.
Yes, I think one of the problems our party had is that we wanted to frame him up as a kind of American right-wing Republican, basically. He is conservative, there's no question, but he's also unbelievably capable of changing his tune. He was a deficit hawk, fiscal conservative, until he wasn't. You know, the budget of 2009 was the largest single deficit spend in the history of the country, and a good thing too, because it saved us from a depression, and I pushed him to do it. But he just flipped overnight. And that aspect of him is not widely understood. Another aspect, and here I'm about to say something in his favor, one of the things about Canadian conservatism that is better and very different from American conservatism is Canadian conservatism has understood, in a way that American conservatism has not, that it lost the culture wars. That is to say, on abortion, gay marriage, a lot of moral issues, they've just understood that the country has made a decision about those things. Gay marriage and abortion are troubling issues for many Canadians, but by and large, the consensus here is we think, you know, equality for all Canadians, regardless of sexual orientation, is just one of the best things we ever did. And conservatives, I think, by and large, accepted that. And that means that they're much closer into the center than American conservatism. And Harper, to his credit, understood this. I think he's got some very religious conservatives in his party. He's got some moral conservatives in his party. He's got some anti-abortion conservatives in his party. And he said, basically, you guys, we want power. We want power, and those issues are just not going to run here. And that's one of the reasons he's prime minister, is that he shaped a conservatism that is in fact substantially different from the conservatism in the United States. And that is one of the basic reasons why he's the prime minister.
He's in somewhat different shape than he was when you wrote the book. And
Yeah,
you see a great difference.
happily. It's not so good.
But can you...
I feel his pain.
I wanted to give you a chance to have a sympathetic word about it. But can you read from even his body language on television or the view of the backbenchers around him? What can you pick up from just watching this on television about the state of him and his morale and his party?
He's got tremendous stamina, but I think it's, I have an instinct. Well, this is the problem in politics. You got to keep what you wish firmly just different from what you think is true. What I wish is that he gets clobbered in 2015. But we are not there yet. It is 2013, and I think some of this stuff is sticking to him. I do think that. I don't know why I think that. It may be, as I say, the wish is father to the thought. I sure hope some of it's sticking to him. But power is relentless, demanding, all-consuming, and you get tired and you make mistakes. I'm stunned at the way he treated his principal private secretary, Nigel Wright. I'm stunned by the ruthlessness of it. I've never seen a body thrown under a bus more ruthlessly in recent Canadian politics than that. That tells you a lot about the man. I don't, whether he can be beaten in 2015 is a matter for those who are now running my party and running the NDP.
Will the debate about a possible coalition come up again? Is that something you saw it down last time, but do you think it could flare before 15?
I hope it does come up. And this is a conversation that I want Canadians to have, because the coalition I was presented with in 2008, I just thought wasn't going to fly. People forget that the numbers didn't add up. I'm in favor of coalition. I'm strongly in favor of coalition government between two parties that retain their identities. The liberals always used to say condescendingly that the NDP are just liberals in a hurry. Not so. They are different traditions. These are two political traditions that ought to respect each other enough to maintain separate identities. But could they coalesce, form a program for government in the event of a minority parliament in 2015 and govern the country well? I mean, look, Britain is a good example. They've had a coalition government that's lasted 5 years and provided very stable, effective government. It's been tough on the junior partner, but that's, in 2008, it just wouldn't fly. But the thing that I hope Canadians won't fall for is the idea that coalition is somehow un-Canadian and unnatural. It's perfectly legitimate constitutionally, and it would be an extremely good idea. But I don't think it can happen before the election. I think what has to happen is that Canadians have to decide how many Liberals go back to Ottawa and how many NDP go back to Ottawa, and then they figure out, if it's a minority, whether they got the capacity to put together an electoral program that would provide the country with stable government. And if that happens, whoopee, I say.
What about short of a coalition in 15, the wink, wink, nudge, nudge approach to dropping out of certain ridings? Could you have a kind of agreement to not run in certain areas where the NDP might win if you're not in it, or the Liberals aren't in it, or vice versa? Just to cut off the Tories more and more?
I think as a practical matter, it's just too difficult.
How would you sell it?
Because you then then the leaders of the parties have to get their mucky fingers into every riding in the country and push people around, and the ridings will back up and resist quite rightly. So I think it's better to have us compete and hopefully hope that the voters are smart enough not to split votes in such a way that the conservatives come up. But look, I'm out of this business now. The one point I want us to think about is that coalition could be very good for this country. I'd obviously like a outright liberal victory in 2015 or 2019 or whenever it's going to happen. But we ought to be thinking about coalition. And I regret the fact that in my time in politics, there didn't seem to be a way to work more effectively with the NDP, because the country, 60% of the country votes for these parties, and 40% votes for the Conservatives, and it would be good for us to get a good, clear sense of those alternatives.
My last question before we go to questions on the floor, so if you want to start getting to place, the microphones do. When I read your book, so much of it has feelings of hurt, has feelings of disappointment in the process, has feelings of disappointment about what you see in fellow politicians. Yet for all that, it ends with a very moving and uplifting call for the young to consider politics. And it also has reflections on things about politics that you found just a sheer joy, a pleasure, which the public probably doesn't think there's anything joyful in politics today. But you found a joy there, and you found enough of a belief in politics to make this very moving call, which I really urge people to read. Could you summarize it a bit for me, how you emerged from the ashes with these profoundly joyful and uplifting thoughts?
Well, my wife Susanna is in the hall here, keeping close watch on me so I don't mess up. But we both found it an unforgettable adventure to... the thing about being a national politician is that you really can spend a morning above the Arctic Circle talking to our Inuit fellow citizens, and then end your day in Vancouver at a Sikh temple, get up the next day and be in freezing your socks off in Winnipeg, and every day you're meeting the extraordinary experience of this country. I mean, most of us live our lives in little circles, and a Canadian federal politician, remember this is the largest democracy by size on earth, lives the whole country. And you can't come through 5.5 years of that without deep feeling about the people you've met. And that is joyful. There's just no question. I mean, it's an amazing thing. And the other thing to say about it is they don't vote for you, but they're mighty nice to you. Right? I mean, this is important. No, this is important. I mean, that's the thing. Susanna and I, you can count on the fingers of one hand the number of times an encounter with a fellow citizen was unpleasant in 5.5 years in public life. And that's something good about this country, right? So you talk about the joy. As for the final chapter, I mean, one of the things, if you're in politics, and I've said this before, I say it again, I always had a palpable sense that in the back of a room somewhere, maybe in a room like this tonight, there's a young Canadian, maybe a woman, I hope it's a woman, in her 20s, looking up at me and thinking, I could do that, right? I could do that. What's he got that's so special? I could do that. And when I failed, I had a very palpable sense of a young person thinking, he didn't get there, but I will. So, we're only in this business for a short period of time, and it just is so important to me to reaffirm faith in the basic experience of representative democracy, putting your name on a ballot and serving citizens in a constituency. My constituency assistant, Mary Cancer, is here. she served and helped 2,000 fellow citizens a year out of our riding office. I mean, that's what you're doing. I mean, this is for real. It's not show business for ugly people. It's, which is what they say about politics. It's more serious than that. It's a wonderful thing to do. And part of what the book is saying is, step up.
Well, I just had one thought that as very much younger men, both Michael and myself were on the Pierre Trudeau plane, 1968, crossing the country. We were Trudeau mania, and I was writing for the Gazette at the time, and I think we were both magically moved, mesmerized by the experience, looking down on that country and feeling that enthusiasm. And to think that after all these years, you can still feel that, still look down on that country, still find that enthusiasm and that hope is a very reassuring thing at a time when things are not always looking that reassuring. I'll go to the first question, please.
Thank you. You've spoken about how coalition governments might be a way to address some of the challenges of our current first-past-the-post system. What about the whole idea of proportional representation? I'd be interested in your own views about proportional representation and whether or not you think they have any future federally in Canada.
It's a great question. I'm basically become in favor of electoral reform. That's what ex-politicians always say. Why weren't you in favor of it at the time? I think I had to discover its adverse consequences. A lot of conservative voters are effectively disenfranchised in certain parts of the country, just as certain liberal voters are disenfranchised in other parts of the country. When I was 18 and voted for the first time in 1965, 80% of the Canadian public voted in a federal election. The percentage now is just below 60. 20% decline in my lifetime. That's not good. And one of the reasons people don't vote is they think it doesn't make any difference in my district. So proportional representation, I'm not going to get into the weeds about which system, but a system where you preferentially, you have a first choice, a second choice, and a third choice, gives some greater weight to your electoral choice. And I think that will do something about turnout. And I think it will make us feel that our votes matter more. So yes. As for its prospects, I think it's a simple case of political leadership. Somebody's got to stand up and say, this may cost me the election, but it's the right thing to do. And that gives you a measure of just how difficult it will be to change.
Yes.
Hi. From everything that I've read and seen about Harper, he seems to be one of the most politically control freak politicians that we've ever had, where he seems to be controlling everything that's said by any of the Conservative MPs. Any agenda that he seems to be involved in. Do you think that it's possible for someone who is so involved in what's going on in the party to have people in his office taking care of Duffy and the Senate scandal and Harper not knowing anything about it?
I think that's what's called a rhetorical question. I'm not, it's a great question. I mean, I can't speculate, but I think it's extremely unlikely that Mr. Harper doesn't know pretty well everything that's going on. It's why he's prime minister. I mean, as I say, I disagree with him politically, but he's a formidable politician, and he will not be casual about the kind of details that you're referring to in your question. He knows what's going on, and therefore is responsible, and therefore should be accountable. I agree.
Michael, just wanted to thank you for coming back to Canada, entering the arena. We just had a by-election in Toronto Centre and had another candidate come from New York and enter politics, and she was a little surprised at how nasty and how down and dirty it got. My question, though, is do we need politicians, potential politicians, who have learned things of the world, business, academia, whatever, and come to the political arena, or do we get the experienced politicians by growing them from the campaign office?
That's a great question. I think you need both. I think I like your metaphor about growing them from the campaign office. I mean, I think that is how it happens. You want people who've grown up inside a political party, learned through a political party at its best is a kind of teaching machine. I mean, it's not just an electoral machine. So you want that, but I think you also want people from outside. One of the things that's happening in all democracies now is that most politicians go in their early 30s and they're lifers. And there's been a narrowing, I think, of our political class and its political experience. I mean, you know, Mike Pearson, who I think has the most impressive legislative record of any prime minister in the 20th century, spent 25 years out of the country. You know, he was all over the world for Canada. Mr. Trudeau, one of the reasons he was a good prime minister on international stuff is he'd been backpacking through China. You know, he had international experience. Having said that, you know, everybody took a shot at the fact that I was just visiting because I had been out of the country. And I think two things about that. I think it's extremely important in a representative democracy for a politician to prove that he's there for you and that he knows what you're going through. And the problem with being out of the country is people think, well, you know, what does he know about us? What does he know about our lives? I get that. And I think it's a good thing that you know, Christia had a great career, but I think it's important that she knocks on every darn door in Rosedale and earn that seat. Doesn't matter what she did for the Financial Times or whatever it was. She has to earn it. The same way I had to earn it. I fought 3 elections and won 2 of them, and I was proud that I earned it door to door. You know, so that on one side. On the other side, we don't want a country where anybody who's been out of the country for a while has to face the barrage of that kind of criticism all the time, because we're a global country. You know, 25% of this city is born somewhere else. And most of your children are, you know, going to be somewhere else and live somewhere else and come back. And we want a kind of open, generous conception of citizenship in which we think being out is part of being a Canadian. And so we got to get that right. And we actually can't allow Mr. Harper to define who's a good Canadian. He doesn't have that power.
I've been involved with 22 federal elections. I'm what you call a political junkie. Starting in 1945, when I went to work with Mr. Bracken and some of the M.J. Caldwell and some of the politicians out in Saskatchewan that I knew. And so I wanted to just say a word about one of the issues that you talked about, and that is how you involve. I've run in 4 federal elections, in 3 provincial elections. I've only won 1, and that was when Joe Clark was the Prime Minister, so I wasn't there very long. But just the same, I'm very keen, still keen on politics, and I'm trying to hold out for the next one. But it does seem to me that there are ways that we can discuss to try to improve the issues that have been raised. One of them is the state of the House of Commons. When I have to turn the television off when I see them discussing things in debate, because when I first was involved in politics, they would talk to each other all the time. They didn't have television. And as a result of not having television, they had to communicate with each other. They had to talk issues that their own people are talking about, and it didn't make any difference about what the party was.
So your question is?
I think that's an important perspective. The one thing I'd ask you, sir, is I think we have an idea that question periods got meaner and nastier and noisier and more ridiculous by the year. but I think honesty requires me to remember Pearson v. Diefenbaker in 1963. That was brutal. It was brutal. We've had recurrent periods when it's just been brutal, hand-to-hand combat. Mr. Pearson hated Diefenbaker. Mr. Diefenbaker hated Pearson. It wasn't pretty.
It was wittier, though. I mean, those guys were funny. They could be really funny.
That's true. And you may be saying that television has made things worse, and I don't disagree. There's a way in which you watch the politicians on Question Period kind of tilting up to the camera. Everybody knows where the camera is and kind of not talking to each other, but just talking to the...
All I'm saying is that the issue that you're talking about is the issue of the numbers of people that are involved. And when you talk about the number of people who voted in particular elections, take a look at the turnout. And every year it's getting worse.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons it's getting worse is because of the issues that you're talking about.
We have time, I think, for about one more question. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Is that right? Two more questions. Sorry. Orders from the wife. Two more questions.
And
Kind of related to his question, I was wondering what would be your how do you think you fix the animosity between parties right now? Like, should we force them to line up together at the airport, or?
yeah. I think this is there's some rule changes. First of all, more free votes. I think it's ridiculous that prime ministers designate the committee chairs in Parliament. I think parliamentary committees ought to have the power to elect their own people and to have the autonomy to call their own witnesses. This seems like insider baseball, but the point is, it's in parliamentary committees that you work together. It's in parliamentary committees that parliamentarians have to put their differences aside and get stuff done. But if you're under whip's discipline in those committees, you can't really serve the people. There are a number of other changes I could go into, but you start changing the rules, that's one thing, and then it comes from the top. It comes from the dominant figure in the Parliament of Canada is the Prime Minister of Canada. And it all comes from his leadership, his example, his willingness to call the dogs back, to keep the dogs under leash. And when he lets the dogs go, everybody else lets their dogs go. But I think I'm optimistic in the sense that anybody who sits in that chamber, it makes your heart beat faster. This is a great room. It's the great room of our democracy. And I just wish there had been more times when we had been worthy of the room and worthy of the people who put us there.
Yes.
Okay, last question, I guess. You talked about having a curiosity for the country. I love the way you put that. What would be the 2 or 3 things that you think either we're currently curious about or that you personally are currently curious about for this country?
Oh, boy. There's so many things we're not quite seeing. I think we're not quite seeing education. We're not quite seeing the linkage between, early learning and child care right through to mature adulthood. We're in a library tonight. We're not kind of putting together a vision of ourselves as a society that's learning from the minute we open our eyes in this world to the moment the lights go out. And a sense that our entire economic future depends on getting that chain of learning from early childhood right to the end of our lives so that literally no one is wasted. I mean, it's all hands on deck, and we're wasting so much talent and so much ability. I could go on about this for hours, but you come back from Germany and you see the way they get high school kids into apprenticeship, the way they're investing in their people. Why are they making the best cars in the world? Because they have the best apprenticeship systems in the world, And we have I'm in an elite institution, but some of the best teaching I've ever seen is done by labor unions, right? I mean, we don't have a We don't have a sufficiently Catholic, ecumenical, broad, imaginative vision of what it would be for Canada to be learning. We do some things extremely well, let me make it clear. You can stack our primary and secondary education against most democratic societies. But if there's a single thing we have to get right, it's that vision of learning from, 12 months old right up to the end of your life as a continuous thing that we do together, that we invest in wonderful public institutions like this, and that it becomes the mighty engine that raises us all up. Because the one thing that was haunting about traveling the country is I saw a lot of people whose lives were wasted because they didn't get a shot. And they didn't get a shot because they didn't get education. And we just got to fix it. We can't afford to look at ourselves in the eye unless, if we feel there are just such a lot of people left out of the promise that is represented by this room. That's what I see.
Michael, thanks.